and welcome to another episode of Digital Diary, Adventures of a Computerized Quilter. Today, we're going to talk about something that's very specific to computerized quilting, and that is a computerized mock-up. And I think we all do them. We do them a little differently. And if you haven't had a chance yourself to try this, I hope this inspires you to do just that. So let's move right into the pictures. Most mock-ups are done in Creative Studio standalone. At least that's how I do mine. Every once in a while, I'll build a boundary and then bring it over to that project over to my standalone. Is that how you guys do this?
Almost always in standalone.
Definitely in standalone, but I usually do a lot of mock-ups over the top of an image.
Yep, that's another way too.
I sometimes will, if the customers are with me and we're standing by my Statler, I will just do a quick mock-up of whatever patterns that we're looking at and then print it off and put it with their invoice.
Yep.
Because sometimes I'm with customers with my Statler, sometimes I'm in another room with my standalone. So it just depends on what's going on that day.
Okay.
And I more often have customers, like I'm emailing or texting them the options and not working with them in person. So while my Statler is working and stitching, I do use standalone mode to create mock-ups for those other customers. But I do it your way too, Deanne. If the customer's in the shop, yeah, they get to see it right there on the Statler.
Okay, I'm going to share Creative Studio now, just for one little bit, and then we'll go back to pictures. I, as you guys, do a lot of stuff where they're not here because the studio has been closed for so long with COVID. So I have a project that I literally call intake, and I have all these categories where I will put things in, like a geometric category. And if I see a quilt, I can take those designs and move them to an area. Then I'll zoom way in. I've used draw text to name it. I'll take my grid off, and then I can do a snippet of just those patterns and send it in an email to a client, so they know what the patterns look like. I used to have books, but this is working so much better for me. And with a Creative Studio and the ability to pull those patterns in, this has worked fantastic. Okay, sometimes what I'll do when I'm doing a mock-up, I'll do just an individual block. And that is the quilt that's behind me. And once I make one block, I can go into repeat patterns and then turn those blocks into boundaries, and I can adjust my patterns over just the boundaries. And that's a great way to do a mock-up. Here is what I do a lot of. If I get a customer's quilt in, I take a picture and then a picture of the individual block. And what I have done is I have used Creative Studio to do a fill around the individual pieces here. And from that, I can make another mock-up using that block. And this is a customer's quilt. I sent her an overall design, and this one, I took the time to do this, and she went for the overall design right over her applique. So that was hard. Sometimes we do a lot of work that we don't get, it doesn't go anywhere.
Right.
This one did take the custom. I just measured the block. It was 8 inches, and I could do this mock-up. So I never used a picture in doing the mock-up. I just counted the blocks and measured the sashes. Another way to do this is if you know the pattern. If you go online, a lot of times pattern companies have really good pictures of their patterns that are straight on, that you don't have to measure anything. And this would be really hard to do as a boundary. And so I just imported the image and clicked over it with a design.
That's a good idea.
I do that too, because it's really hard to take a straight on square picture of a quilt, even a small section. So if you have the graphic from the company, or something built in, in the EQ programs or something like that, it's usually pretty perfect, more perfect than the quilt, but it gives a really good idea of the quilting.
Absolutely. And you're right. That square, straight on photograph is very important.
I just said Google Images is our friend in this case.
Yep. I do have a design wall that I pin things onto. This is one that I'm currently working with the client. And so I pinned it up. I did this mock-up and she wasn't sure. She didn't like it. So then I did the individual photo of a close-up and 2 versions of the block that I could put over this color wash quilt. And we are still emailing back and forth. This was one that was mailed to me. So
I have a question.
Yeah.
My question is then, so do you include this time, the prep time, in your billing to your customer? Because you mentioned earlier when you gave a customer an option between custom and edge to edge, they went with edge to edge. So therefore obviously paid less for the finished quilting, but you still went to all of the work to give them, a mock-up to look at on the custom side. And that's a lot of work. So how do you charge for that? Do you, or do you just call it part of the process?
Actually, I justify it. It's not necessarily a charge. When someone does do a more of a custom, like this one will be, it goes into the charge. But if I'm giving someone a choice between things, the more I do this, the faster I get at it and the better I get at it. So I have a lot of experience and I take the time to gain that experience and consider it an investment in my own education. So no, I don't charge for it, but if I'm doing a high-end custom, that is built in. But not on this is choice A and choice B. Very good question.
You do an intake charge though does that cover this?
I do a setup fee.
A setup fee.
And that's part of me buying a pattern, putting the pattern together, putting it on the frame. And that I allocate by square yards. So a larger quilt has a larger setup fee. So I guess you could say it's kind of rolled into that, but not really. Now, this is me using a picture to actually design the piece that went in here. There was a lot of open space, so I took a picture of where I was so far, and then all of this is just my patterns over the photograph image that I imported into Creative Studio. And that's how that one turned out. A lot of times it is so much easier to do something. You have an idea in your head, you don't know what it's going to look like. If you can use the picture, it's amazing.
Well, and another important part there, Paige, was you changed the patterns as sewn. Instead of keeping them black on that dark background, you made them red, so that you could actually see the design a little bit better on the top of that photo.
Yeah, I found I had to. And sometimes if you highlight the pattern, it's yellow.
Yep.
That's helpful. And you can change the colors. In fact, when I first did this, every other row on here is a different color of thread. So I did it red and black, but the black didn't show up. You're right.
Well, what I do is lighten the image in Creative Studio. I do that a lot. You use the image attributes to do that.
Yeah, we're going to see some good examples of that. I think George is up next. You want to tell us about this one?
Yep, and that's exactly what I did. Is I always take the picture. This is one I got off of Google Images. Anytime someone brings me a quilt and I'm pretty sure that there's a pattern for it, if I'm going to be trying to do a mock-up, I'm always going to ask what is the name of the pattern, because they have generally quilt pictures that are straight on. Although some people are getting a little more artsy now and laying them across chairs and stuff, which doesn't help much. But if I can get that, and then I lighten the image and I go ahead and put it on. This one was a really fast, easy one to do. In reality, I don't often do the entire quilt because it's because of time. No one, quote, pays you for that time. If it's a high-end custom, then yeah, I build that time in, but on a quilt like this, I don't. So they don't always get an entire, this is what the whole quilt will look like picture. Not for me.
Yeah, I love doing this particular style of quilting. I call it my semi-custom.
Oh yeah, it's quick and easy. Yeah, it's the easiest, right? The easiest custom to do. So.
Okay, let's move on to a not so easy custom, huh, Georgia?
Yeah. And that's this one. This quilt, obviously, I rarely do a mock-up like this with everything. And I did it mostly to do a class because there's a lot of interest in doing the entire quilt mock-up. But I will tell you, from my point of view, for the most part, a fourth of the quilt is the same as the other 3/4. Like, you could take a fourth of the quilt and it's identical. So very often I will do only a quarter of the quilt, or even less, but not much more than. This is one I did just to get an overall feel for it, and so you can see what it looks like. And actually, this one was what I call a reverse mock-up. After I quilted it in a quilt group, I grabbed the sewn patterns and then put them into the first quilt group, which was my mock-up. That's the one thing I think a lot of people don't understand when they're beginning. And that's what my representation of Creative Studio, when I very, very first started many years ago, was I was going to put all the patterns on the screen and push quilt. And it doesn't work. You cannot work. You can create the mock-up, but it actually is your map. That's all it is. I have seen people try to quilt with all these patterns on the screen. It doesn't work well. It's not efficient. It slows everything down. So to me, if I do this, it is a map and it stays in my first quilt group. That's it.
I call this a blueprint.
Yeah, blueprint, map, whatever.
It's a plan. And I have done them after I've quilted them, especially if I'm going to do a block in the month and I know I'm getting more of them, or a design that you see over and over again. This is a great use of that.
Right. And this one was sort of like a block of the month. And you can see that there are 2 blocks that were the same in the quilt. And so, and that's the hardest thing, is when you decide which block that looks similar, it's a similar style, but which one is going to go where. It's hard when the pictures are little. So in that case, I do like knowing which block is going to get which pattern per se in a coordinated set. But
we do have another picture of this quilted out.
Yeah.
And I have a question here. When I first looked at that, it was hard to tell if you had used fill or trim, but on this, you can see that each section is an individual pattern.
Yes, ma'am.
So it worked out beautifully. A blueprint for this.
What?
I said, no, you really need a blueprint or a plan.
Yeah, right. But there's a funny story behind this one, because in the center, there was, a big area of center design, and a portion of it, I kept trying to click it out and put a pattern in. And if you look closely on the right side versus the left side, you can see that there's a difference. And it's because she had inadvertently, well, actually, she made that one right and the other three were wrong. And so I kept clicking out boundaries, trying to put this pattern in, like, what is the matter with me? It won't work. And it wasn't that. But the beauty of it is you really have to look hard to tell that there was a mistake on the quilt, because you keep the flow going and you keep the style going. But yeah, the right side is different than all three other sides of that center emblem. But I think in the end, you don't really notice it as much. And I know you can see two little empty white triangles. Trust me, I filled them, but I had to be creative, you know, I just had to be, but I thought it was me. I just kept making the boundary. I'm like, why won't this fit? And yeah, it wasn't me. But you know, that's what we do as quilters is, you know, we improvise, we make do, and we make it look good no matter what.
Isn't it funny when you make the boundary, that's when you see the mistake?
Oh yeah, I didn't see the mistake.
And
well,
then
even after I made the
now I know why.
I made the boundary probably 3 times trying to figure out what I was doing wrong. And so even then I was like, what? This isn't, because I still didn't see it. You're so close to it. It's really hard to see that individual, you know, area that isn't what was originally planned, but it worked out.
Yeah.
So
no, it looks great. Looks good from here. Tell us about this one, Georgia.
This is one, I don't always get somebody who wants a quilt of valor that is like over the top, but this was a special quilt a woman had made for her husband. He was gone, but it was more to honor him. And she doesn't usually pay for custom. And it's the first time I ever had someone say, I want really nothing patriotic on it. But she did end up putting that one border, the little,
dog
I'm trying to think which one. Right, it's the dog tags, but which is the blue border. So you don't really see them a lot, but she wanted the outside border and the inside. She just wanted it over the top. And so it was kind of a challenge for me because it seemed like, you know, it was just different. And so this is what I came up with. And you can see that, and I had other shots where I showed what I did on the inside part, the center part. But for her, I mean, the most important thing is, how do these patterns look next to each other? Do they work? Do they coordinate? And this is what I do more often than not. And if there were blocks, I normally would have at least 1 or 2 blocks in there, just so you can see how they look with each other. And I try really hard to keep them to scale. You know, it's an 8-inch border on the outside and an 8-inch border and then a 6-inch. I want them to scale, they get the feel for it.
That's a very good point, Georgia. When I'm using patterns and boundaries, I'm always doing them to scale. When I put it over a photo or an image, that's when it's not necessarily to scale, but they're all relative to one another in aspect.
Right.
I think it's interesting that your border went right over the corners. And I think that's cool.
Right. You mean that funky little bear? It was, yeah. I think is that a bear paw? And I had the hardest time. I played and played with patterns. And this is the one that just seemed like it fit with it perfectly, because I got that big swirl on each one of those little corner pieces. And she was very happy with it. I mean, you know, that's the thing when a customer comes and they like cry. They're so happy because it's the image they wanted it, and it makes it. That's what quilting.
Well, this is a very personal quilt too.
It was very personal to her. It really was. And so that's why sometimes as a quilter, you have to take the images that are in your head out and really listen to them for what they want and what they like. And it sometimes takes more time because you'll show them styles and you know, everything I thought it just didn't do it for her, because this isn't what I envisioned, but it is what she envisioned. And that's what matters.
Were you working with her as you did this, or you let her pick designs?
You know, what I do is I get a feel for things. So with her, I showed her a style of patterns, and then they say yes or no. Like she didn't particularly like big feathers. She kind of liked the nice tight feathers. She loved pearls and she loved piano keys. So that's as much as I had. And she wanted, the only place she cared about having anything military was that blue border. And so keeping the colors dark there kept that from shining so much, but made it work. So at that point, then I worked in standalone mode in center pictures. So just enough to get started.
There's a close-up of that swirl coming into the bear paw.
I know. Didn't it work though? I was like, wow, it was a tough corner.
Yeah, it's amazing. It makes you see that there are other things. See, I would have put a block there, but this is,
well, she wanted those paws to be very visible and it was important to her. So,
well, it worked out. Let's see what else we got. Deanne, I think you're next.
Okay. This is a quilt that is coming up soon. I hung it up so I could take a picture of it, and I don't keep them hanging very long because it can distort them, stretch out different blocks, especially along the top. So I took a picture of it. It's huge. It's like 118 by 118. So there's the picture full color. And then I think our next picture, you can see where I have gone to image attributes and I have eased up the color so that I can see what the patterns look like that I'm putting on. And as you can tell, it is not done yet. I'm just doing a quarter of it, like Georgia was talking about. And I am seeing how the patterns play with one another. And I know that the star, I'm not going to keep that pattern because even though it coordinates with the others, it's the size difference of those feathers that is not working well.
Yeah, I think it's a little dense in comparison to the others. That'll just kind of sink in. So do you take several pictures of your quilt in different areas?
I do. And if you look at the top of the, where the different groups are, different quilt groups, I actually have a different section or size of the quilt in each one of those, right, so that I can then go and play with a small section, go to a bigger section, just look at the borders, things like that.
Yeah, it's so much easier to be able to do this while your Statler's making you money elsewhere.
Yeah, exactly.
It is.
And this is a big project. I can see where you have to think it out. So tell us about this. It looks familiar.
It does look familiar. I often will do my mock-up, not worry about stitch order. So you can see where I have stitching going here and there because I used fill and it made a bit of a mess, but it doesn't matter on the mock-up because that's not the purpose of it. At this point, I want to see what goes well with each other. And I will print it off and then maybe write in on there, okay, I think I'm going to use this color thread here and this color here, this pattern here.
That's a great tip.
And then I have a whiteboard that I have right next to the Statler computer, and I will attach this with magnets to my whiteboard, so it's always sitting right there so I can compare it no matter which quilt group I might have open. It's always there reminding me what I'm doing.
Good. And sometimes I'll put my laptop on the next to my Statler so that I have, my mock-up in Creative Studio on my laptop next to what I'm actually quilting.
Mm-hmm.
Not quite the whiteboard approach, but close.
Yeah, I'm old enough to have old school and be comfortable with it.
Oh yeah, I'm happy with printing it off and making notes on there. We've come a long way from graph paper. I love graph paper. That's why I like drawing boundaries in Creative Studio. So there's the finished product.
And there's the finished product. So yeah, it was just a fun way of practicing. And it's also something that I can show customers when they come in that, when I'm doing your custom quilt, I mock it up. And so if you need me to send you some options, I can do that. And we can have 2 or 3 different choices of types of patterns that you want on there. Do you want a bit more modern? Do you want some more, with straight lines and some circles? Or do you want more traditional with feathers and things? And when they bring it in, they might just be looking at me going, I don't know. And
the
so
picture is very important in that respect.
It is. And so that they're happy with the work, before any stitching is done.
Yeah, let's see. Let's move on here. I believe this is Karen.
It is. And so this looks different than some of what we've seen already because I do a ton of edge-to-edge quilting. And so sometimes the only images I'm sending to the customer is a choice between a couple of different or 3 or 4 different edge-to-edge patterns. And often I will use a picture of the quilt and then put repeats of 2 or 3 or 4, in this case, options on top of that image. It depends on whether we're just trying to make decisions on style or whether we're trying to make decisions on a final quilt pattern. So like in this case, we knew we wanted swirls. We knew exactly what we wanted, and she just wanted some options. And then, of course, I used the text feature in Creative Studio and put numbers on it because they'll say, oh, I like the lower left. And, maybe that's not my lower left. So, because I can be directionally challenged. So I put the numbers on there and I'll shoot them a text and they will be able to tell me, oh, I love this one or that one, and pick patterns that way. So even for edge to edge, I still do kind of a mock-up. I still give them options that way.
Yeah, I like that. Being able to email, and I've never thought of the numbers. I put the name on there because sometimes I'll get that email back 5 days later and I can't remember what number 4 was. Like you said, lower left, no clue.
Right. But it makes such a difference when you're putting several of them together so that they're not just looking at one pattern. They can see how they interact with a repeat of them. Yeah. And they're not those old books that we used to have with the little 2x2. And they're going, I don't think I want it that tight.
That is, yeah, you're right. That is so important to be able to see how the repeats relate to each other. And the other cool thing that we can do, of course, in Creative Studio is we can audition patterns from the store. So we don't even have to own them. We can get them on our screen, on the CAD screen, and create these images to have the customers choose. And then if that's the pattern they choose, we can purchase that design.
Oh yeah, I do that one a lot too. So many good tips to use in mock-ups. Tell us about this one.
Yep. So this one is similar to what we've seen already. It's a kind of a close-up shot of a customer quilt that I had a little while ago. So this is an actual direct-on shot of the quilt. And then I just played around with which designs would go in which space. And actually, as a designer, I do this as well for designing. I use the mock-up concept. So I'll take that snapshot of a quilt and then take it into Creative Studio, and you can actually draw the patterns, create the patterns right on that image. And that way I can make them balance and I can make them coordinate and stuff like that. So
that's a really good tip.
Same thing.
So graphic.
This is a mock-up that I sent to a customer because I have a lot of point-to-point or on-point triangles. And of course, because I want to keep my job as easy as possible, I really wanted to quilt this chevron quilt with draw pattern. So point-to-point patterns. So I have plenty of point-to-point patterns to choose from. So I just did a zigzag. I did a row line in each style and sent that to them and had them choose which style they liked. And actually we wanted to coordinate. So do one style in the yellow, one style in the blue. And so they chose which two patterns they wanted to use on that quilt.
That is super cool. So is this done up in EQ, or did you go and grab an image off the internet?
This was actually, usually I do it off the internet, but this one I made up pretty quickly. It was not in EQ, but it was in a drawing program. So I just whipped this one up in a drawing program, but not EQ7 or EQ whatever. What are we on?
8.
I don't know. 8? Yeah, I don't have the latest one.
So which one did she choose?
She chose the pearls, obviously, because pearls are amazing. And then I think we did, honestly can't remember, we did a linear in the other one, which I think was like the angles one.
Yeah, I think so.
Yep, same thing. But this picture, like was mentioned, I got this gravity right off of the design website. So it was a perfectly square image, and, you know, just lightened it a little bit and then placed patterns on. Point to point again, make my job easier and to make sure that this is what the customer wanted. So easy, easy. It takes just seconds to do a search online to see if you can find an image, a really good you know, nice square image of a quilt.
Yeah, it's come in so handy, the internet and images. Okay, now we're on to Christine.
Love that.
So I do a lot more high-end custom bits, and I'm designing a lot of the patterns as I go. And a lot of times I actually am working with the designers of the patterns. So they actually give me, like in this case, I get that perfectly square digital image from the designer, sometimes even before it's finished piecing, so that we can go back and forth and talk about different design options before they've even finished piecing the quilt top. And a lot of times I'm doing this over email because a lot of my customers are not even in the same state that I'm in. So in this case, you can see I came up with lots of different options, and we kind of had to work through what she really wanted to accent in this quilt. So that upper left, I started playing with, you know, do I want to add in extra ghost circles? And I really wanted the idea of that border in there. And so she wanted some feathers, but not too many. So it was just a matter of working through different options. After I would do a mock-up, I'd send it and get feedback and go back and do another mock-up. So in this case, she really wanted to accentuate that X. So a lot of times when I'm doing this kind of really basic style of mock-up, I'm literally just using draw line and draw arc to create some of the basic structure architecture pieces of the quilt. So in this case, you know, there's a lot of negative space that I have to play with, and I wanted to build in some structure. And so in order to build in that structure, again, I'm using draw line and draw arc, not only on the mock-up, but then when I actually go to place designs on the quilt, yeah, I'm using the designs that I created with the draw line and draw arc to actually stitch out when I get it on the quilt.
Yeah, this is way over the top.
I
don't do anything like this. But we all use it so differently. That's what I love about Creative Studio. Now, here's another one. I like the fact that you're giving us finished quilts.
Well, and it gives you an idea of what it actually looks like. So in this case, you know, I knew I wanted to play with those circular patterns. So I pulled some of those patterns that I've used in the past and some of those circular elements. And again, in order for me to see them on that black background, I'm changing them to sewn, right? So they're not black patterns on a black background. So that we can actually see them, because even if I lighten it, you're still not going to get that effect. But you can just see working through the process of what kind of options go in which places. This particular customer definitely likes knowing a whole lot more about what is actually going to be stitched on her quilt up front before I actually start. And so a lot of times specifically for this customer, I have much more of a mock-up than for some other clients. So it's really, when I start working with customers and going back and forth, I get a sense for how much of that mock-up I have to give them up front as well.
Now, obviously, you save these things. I do have a folder that I have mock-ups in that I can go back to for ideas.
Well, and a lot of times I have, so they'll send me a picture of their quilt before I even get their quilt in my hands so that I can start the design process. And like with the last one, I started designing over that digital image before she even finished constructing the quilt top. And so I save a lot of my, not only my design mock-ups, but sometimes the patterns I'm using in the same directory on my computer. So I can definitely go back and pull up, you know, I liked this from mock-up 1, I like that from mock-up 2, you know, that sort of thing.
So Christine, when you do your mock-ups, do you adjust the size of the image before bringing it into Creative Studio so you can work on it close to what the image actual size is?
Typically not. I don't usually worry about adjusting size. I look at mostly the scale of how the patterns are playing with each other. And so a lot of times I pull in a pattern and it's massive compared to the image, so I have to shrink everything down. Occasionally I'll have problems where designing over the top of an image, it's just too small and I can't get the detail I need in the mock-up. So I'll actually go and resize that image and pull it in again so that it's resized bigger. But I rarely find that I need to do that, because a lot of times my mock-ups are very much like everyone's been saying, they're kind of the roadmap, the blueprint of what I'm going to actually be doing on the quilts, not the actual quilting itself. Because once I actually get that quilt on the frame, then that's when I design the pattern to actually fit the boundary I've clicked out. So in this case, like I was trying to see how different patterns worked with the composition she already had constructed. So that very top left corner, and I was playing with some different pattern styles. You can see that very traditional cable. I was playing with possibly trying to work that in. And I liked,
make the cut.
It didn't make the cut. But I liked the idea of creating, you know, frames around it. And so you can see that bottom mock-up only has that single frame, but when I actually started stitching it, it really needed something else in the center. And so I created that frame behind those little arced pieces, kind of grounded a little bit better. So, I mean, while I had that mock-up, I still implemented something else when the quilt talked to me when it was actually on the frame. So here's another thing. Like I said, a lot of times I'm speaking with dealing with people who are designing quilt tops and they haven't even pieced them yet. They bring me in right at the very beginning of the process before in this case, before we've even made some fabric choices. And so she sketched out the quilt, and literally this is that graph paper you're talking about, Paige. She sent me a picture of her graph paper image because she's not that computer kind of person. And I imported it and started doing all of my mock-ups over the top of that sketched out image. And at this point, I could even help and assist her in terms of, here's what I want to put in these certain areas of the quilt. And if you haven't chosen the fabric for this area, here's what I would suggest, right? So like I can actually imprint some of that design influence at this point as well. So this was actually an interesting quilt. One of the reasons I was working from the image is we had 2 weeks to get this quilt done. It was going to be in a TV show. And so she wanted me to have a complete layout done before she was done piecing it, right? Because we only had 2 weeks. And so I needed to make sure I had an absolute roadmap of this quilt before it got on my frame.
Oh, Okay, so speaking of time, this, I mean, I think I go to a lot of work. I'm a drop in the bucket compared to this. How long does it take you to put this many things together? And how long does it take a client to get a quilt on your list?
It takes quite a while. And again, I don't necessarily charge setup kind of fees, but it's one of those, it's kind of built into my custom charge. I've definitely gotten a lot faster. And like I said, a lot of times I don't do this complete level of mock-up, right? This was much more because I knew I was on a time crunch. I needed to absolutely have those patterns ready to go.
Yep. It's another version of planning ahead.
It is. And so this is actually, Georgia was mentioning what you actually quilted afterwards. So this is all of the patterns on one quilt group. And in order to get the black and white image, I went and toggled everything unsewn again so that I get that nice black and white instead of the red. And oh yeah, that's that quilt hanging at Paducah. It definitely gives a lot of interest and movement to that quilt.
Those are some very dark images. I bet there's a lot of thread in that quilt.
There's a ton of thread in this one. Yep.
How big is that quilt? It's hard to tell from the picture.
It's about 90 by 90.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so it's pretty big. Like I said, we had 2 weeks to get it done. Luckily, her piecing was fairly easy and went fast, so I needed to make sure the quilting I could get done in that time frame too. Okay, so this is another example. Again, I'm working with a pattern designer who's giving me those nice square images from her graphic design program, so I can just import them directly. And you can see where I'm taking different options. Like, we really wanted to play with that kind of compassy kind of effect, and it just wasn't playing well for us. And then I really wanted to get some sort of circular elements in there, right? So I literally just put some circles over it to get our flow going. In the bottom left, I literally traced over her piecing, right? And then took that pattern and moved it off of where the piecing area was to give me a nice ghost effect. So that we could kind of start playing with, do we ghost out some of that piecing into that negative space? The middle bottom, we're just playing with taking those lines out on the quilts. And you can see this, some of these, like the top ones with the compass, it's a very specific pattern and I'm trying to do something very specific, but all of the others are fairly simple in terms of the mock-up so that we can talk about different design concepts going forward. And then the couple on the right, we're actually testing out specific patterns, how they fit within that piecing. And you see what actually went on this quilt is a whole lot more complex now. We actually wanted to play with like magnetic lines. And so this is kind of an artist interpretation of that. And so I, again, created about a quarter of it and wrapped it around. But here's the big thing. Some of those big arcs that I have going on there, this quilt is, again, probably 70 by 80, that sort of thing. So some of those big stitched arcs, like it's one pattern on my screen, but in order to actually get it to stitch out, it's past my throat space. So I actually have to stitch it out in multiple pieces. And so, there's a lot of how do you relocate accurately and how do you continue stitching a pattern once you've come to an end and stopped and rolled the quilts. How do you continue that? I think because Creative Studio allows me to do these mock-ups over the top of that entire quilt, I definitely see the quilting as a different piece. I can see it as a different design aspect of the quilt itself. But you can kind of see in there where we've explored different design options. I'm not doing a whole lot in the mock-up at the very beginning. I'm just doing very straight, simple lines. And then as we start fleshing it out, we can add more detail. So I don't spend a lot of time on some of those early mock-ups. Again, very simple draw line, draw arc. And then I actually start designing the patterns for the space.
Well, I think that was incredible. You guys have some wonderful examples of using mock-ups in our daily quilting.
I like how we all use it similarly, but like not. So we all use it differently.
Well, our styles are different, our businesses are different, and this just goes to show one more time that Creative Studio has something for everybody. No matter how you use it, it is going to really work for you. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you've seen some things that you'd like to try. And please come back and join us once again for Digital Diary, Adventures of a Computerized Quilter. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.